Hello and welcome back to the Pave the Way podcast, a joint initiative with Rahagiri Foundation and the National Institute of Urban Affairs, where I, your host Akash Basu, speak with mobility experts and people with interesting ideas around the globe on all kinds of issues and ideas surrounding sustainable mobility and transport planning. On today's episode, I will have the pleasure of speaking with the Managing Director for India at the International Council on Clean Transportation, Amit Bhatt. Amit was formerly the Executive Director of Integrated Urban Transport at WRI, India, and has over 20 years of experience in the field of urban transport, non-motorized transport, public transportation, road safety, electric mobility, and urban development. Today, I will be speaking with Amit on the role of governance when it comes to transport in Indian cities, where the issues lie, and when it comes to the provision of sustainable transport, how can we pave the way forward for a better future? So without further ado, let me introduce our guest for today. How are you, Amit?
Very good. Thanks a lot, Akash, for the introduction.
Absolutely. Pleasure to have you on. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting topic, and I think the listeners will learn a lot through listening to this conversation. So let's just get started. How can or does governance and policy making specifically influence the development of sustainable transport systems in Indian cities specifically?
I think it's a very interesting question and something that a lot of us who are working in this space have been trying to or grappling with to understand how does the governance of transport work in cities. Especially when we're talking about cities, we are largely looking at urban transport. Now, if you look at transportation as from the institutional perspective, transportation is being delivered in our cities by multiple agencies. So you have the municipal corporation who do a bit of transport. You also have the public works department, the central public work and the state public works department. Then you also have development authorities. Then you have bus transport companies. Then you have metro companies. Then you have National Highways Authorities of India. Then you have, if you have waterway, then you have Waterways Authority. Then you have railways. Then you have airways. And so it's hugely fragmented. And someone did, I looked at a couple of studies which they said that even cities like Delhi, Bangalore, or any metropolitan city, and if you start mapping who provides transport in the cities, the list would be somewhere close to 18-20 agencies. You will find there be almost 18 to 20 agencies who would be responsible for providing transportation.
In each city, like separately 18 to 20?
Absolutely, yeah.
My God.
If you go to smaller cities, that number would be slightly lower. Mm-hmm. But I am pretty sure any cities in India, the number will be in double digits. Now, if you have these many agencies providing transport, the question then becomes who decides project, who approves the project, who monitors the project, who delivers the project, so on and so forth. Now, I'm not saying that there has to be only one agency that should deliver transport. I mean, for example, if you have an agency that specializes in metro construction, you can't expect the same agency to, let's say, run buses, right? Mm-hmm. So there will be different agencies, but cities which have good transport system have one common theme. And that theme is there is one agency that plans transport. So if you look at Transport for London, which does it in London, similarly LTA in Singapore, you have examples from New York, you have examples from Seoul. Multiple cities which have good transport system have one planning agency. Now, once that agency does the plan, execution is done by separate agencies, which is all fine. But the problem with us is that these many agencies plan the system. Often this planning competes against each other. And then whichever agency has more power, more money, generally prevails upon. So someone really said that planning is very disorganized and fragmented in India, in Indian cities. And that is why we see such a kind of unintegrated system that we see. So I personally believe a lot of problem on transport in our cities is not a technical problem, but it is a governance problem. And that is why we are seeing transport in our cities as we see right now.
Mm-hmm. And with a problem that seems so identifiable, which is that, you look at successful countries and successful cities as well, and you see that one integrated party takes the decisions. Why is it that Indian cities are not able to do that?
I think it's a very good question. And this is something that most of us have been grappling and struggling to find an answer. So the need for a unified transport authority was realized almost 20 years back, where there was a provision called the Urban Metropolitan Transport Authority, UMTA. Now, this was propagated by the Ministry of Urban Development, as it was called then. Now it is Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. And the proposal was that each city should have one agency that plans for all the transport within that metropolitan area.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was pretty simple. If you have one agency that plans, then the planning will be integrated, it will be cohesive, it will respond to the city's need, while the execution can be done by other agencies which are specialized either in construction, in operation, maintenance, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on paper, it's a very good idea. 20 years later, we don't have a single functioning UMTA, so as to speak. There are UMTAs which are created, but again, most, if not all, are just there on paper without any meaningful kind of existence. And there are multiple reasons why it is happening as it is. So if you create a new agency and you want to give agency that power, either that power is new or that power will come from other agencies. Now, if the power is going to come from other agencies are not willing to let go that power.
Mm.
So, for example, if I am, let's say, a road building agency in a city where I plan road, I construct road, and I operate road, and tomorrow, if I have to give that planning function to someone else, why will I do it, right?
Right.
So agencies are not letting go their power. So that is one. Secondly, most of these UMTAs have not been created by a legal mandate, which means there is no law which backs their creation. Most of it is done by executive order, but so that's also the reason why it's not running. And third, which is very important, I think a lot of people in the political circle have really not understood the importance of such agencies. For them, it's just one more agency, and why you want to create another agency. But they don't understand the power of such a unified agency. And that is why we are seeing there's not too much push around creating of juntas, as we call them, in our cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. So not having a unified agency seems to be the top of the issue. But when we look at creating sustainable transport for our cities, I mean, we are lacking on many fronts in major metropolitan Indian cities. What are the other issues? Because not having a unified body will certainly mean that it's difficult to agree on certain things. But when we know the climate issue and our, road safety issues, why is it that we are not able to improve these?
Absolutely. And so one, I think there's also, because we don't have a unified agency, we don't get a unified transport. That's pretty simple. But we also have to understand London took almost 80 years to get a unified agency. Now, should we wait for 80 years? Absolutely not. Because then the kind of growth of population that we are seeing, the economic growth that we are seeing in our country, if we don't solve the problem right now, it will be very difficult to solve in next 15, 20, 30 years. So I think one is that we have to find a way to create these agencies, or at least this agency which can done that one. The question is, if this is taking time, what can we do in the interim? Now, one way to look at it is that instead of having this super agency with all that power and also the money, because you have to understand, unless the money is routed through the agency, the other agency will not listen to the agency. So for example, if I am, let's say, a UMTA of a city, and let's say you are let's say a road building company. If I tell you, Akash, don't build or this 20 kilometers of road, you might say, but why should I listen to you? I have money, I will build my road. Right. And that is what we are seeing in our cities right now. Even in cities which have UMTA, agencies are not listening. And the reason they are not listening is money is not routed through this agency. So if you look at Transfer for London as an example, it does the planning, but it also regulates the investment. So, for example, the same example, let's say I give a TFL analogy. If let's say you're a road building company and if I tell you, Akash, you have to be 20 kilometers of road, you will then ask me, but where is the money? Then I will say, look, this is the money. Now go and build 20 kilometers of road, and you will do it. So apart from creating agencies with the power, we also have to make sure that the money that goes into transport is routed through this agency, and then the agency will get its power. Right now, the way it is happening is, in all the municipal corporation budgets and all, a certain earmark budget is fixed. So this much will go to PWD for roads. This much will go to bus company for buses. This much will go to this. It's all predetermined. Now the question is there a justification of why an agency should get this much budget or not? So there is no agency. So that's also creates the problem that we are just following a routine example. If I get this much budget, I have to do this much road. Whether that amount of road is needed or not, no one is questioning it. Right? So that's one problem. The second problem is also that long back, almost 10, 15 years back, again, a central scheme was created, which asked cities to do comprehensive mobility plans. So when JNURM program was launched, one of the prerequisites for accessing the fund was cities should prepare a comprehensive mobility plan. And the reason was that cities will prepare a long-term plan, which will give them a direction where they have to move towards. And then they will use the money to implement the plan. Now, what happened was cities did prepare the plan. They used the plan to get the JNURM funds. But for their own funds, they never relied on the CMP plan. So they did. So whatever they wanted to do on transport, they did on their own, never consulting a CMP which was developed for them. That document was only used to access funds from the central scheme. And
oh my God.
So that the CMP does not have any legal backing. So even if you want to question the city why you are doing it, there's no legal backing to the document, and so they can do it. So right now what we are seeing is because of lack of no comprehensive, there's a huge lack of institutional issues. There is a big lack of governance, and we are not measuring transport the way we should measure transport in our cities. Now, typically, if you look at the response is this city has this much jam. So again, few days back, a news article came out. Bangalore it's the most traffic jam city in the country. The question is that something we should measure? And I personally believe that's not the KPI for measuring how effective the city moves. What we have to measure is travel time is one that we have to measure. But travel time should be measured on the passenger level. So, for example, in Mumbai, a lot of people use suburban train system. And these trains are faster than road transport. Should I measure road transport to show the efficiency of movement in the city? Absolutely not. So we have to measure travel time. We have to measure passenger travel time. That's one. We also have to measure the externalities that come out from transport, which is we have to measure road traffic deaths and serious injuries. We have to measure modal shift, and we have to measure air quality. Because transport has links to all these things together. And if you start measuring these things, and let us say if my air quality level in a city is going down, I have to do something to transport. If I'm saying if the modal shift is going down, then I have to do something. These kinds of periodic measurements are not happening in a city. So a city does not have any record on how sustainable my transport is. And that narrative is then taken over by this traffic jam narrative. And then the response to traffic jam is more roads, more flyovers. And then we all know that it's an induced demand that you get created. You provide more roads, you get more traffic, and then you have more traffic, you add more road. It gets into the vicious cycle, which is why the cities are struggling so bad right now.
Yeah. And I'd written an article about this, and induced demand works the other way too. If you shorten roads or provide more sustainable mobility options, people will start using those options. And is it just a case that, because, we talk about not having a unified agency, and if you look at, let's say, just Gurgaon from 10 years ago to today, getting from point A to B in a car has become easier, significantly, almost anywhere you need to go. But any sort of sustainable mode of transport, when it comes to walkability, same or worse, cyclability, same or worse, public transport and last mile connectivity, same or worse. So even with a lack of unified agency, it seems as though people in cars still benefit, but people, using sustainable modes don't. So is it just a case of our policy is just too car centric? Is there no way to change that?
So we also have to understand that, and you are very right with this example. And in fact, this example is probably there in most, if not all, Indian cities. And the reason is pretty simple. The reason is that people who are economically well off, unfortunately, are the ones who have cars. These are the people who are very close to decision makers. These people have voices in the city whose voices are heard. And therefore, anything that is related to traffic jam is an easy fix in the short term. People get happy without realizing that in the long term, it doesn't benefit. Delhi has done a series of road widening, expansion, flyover creation, and I've been witnessing that city for at least 25 years now. The travel time, believe me, has not improved even with all that investment. We are still at what we were 20 years back. Dhalakua, still the problem. AIMS, still the problem. And the reason is pretty simple, is that if you are traveling in peak hours, if you look at peak hour travel in any Indian city, it is roughly 15-16 kilometers per hour, you'll find speed. That has not changed at all in last 15-20 years. What has changed is that in the off-peak hour, you will drive fast. And so people feel happy. But these investments are not made for off-peak hours. These investments are made thinking that in the peak hour, you will travel faster.
Correct.
And unfortunately, the people who are walking, cycling, or in buses are the ones whose voices are not heard. And so therefore, you see most cities don't have a good quality walking infrastructure. Most cities don't have any good or reasonably good quality cycle tracks. Bus shares are consistently going down in our cities, but all that effort is now moving towards creation of roads and for cars. And so that's the reason. So we also have to change this conversation that people who are walking, cycling, and using, how can their voices be heard? How can their voices go into decision making? That will bring a massive, massive change, which unfortunately is not happening right now.
Do we have any idea how we could make that happen? How do you bring these people as stakeholders into this conversation?
So I think we'll have to also think slightly more creatively on how do we bring these voices. Bangalore did one good experiment long back, which was stopped, I think, during the COVID, but probably that is the bus day. So every Wednesday or one of the days of the week was bus day, where everyone would pledge to use buses. Similarly, a lot of politicians, ministers would use public transport on a given day. Ragiri is one great example which has really changed the conversation from being something, from being walking as something which was for the poor to walking as something which is cool, which is hip, and people are not are do want to walk given that if you provide good infrastructure. So I think we have to elevate this conversation. We have to create more champion stories. Few years back, there was a big social media trend on called "Great Things Happen at Transit." So I think we have to bring these stories of people who are walking, cycling, using buses as a fun for. We have to create them as champions. We have to create them as agents of change. We have to also get movie stars, who regularly endorse automobile, to also endorse about walking, cycling, and buses. So we have to elevate the conversation of walking, cycling as something which cuts across income strata. Everyone walks, everyone cycles. I think then we will see a much greater change.
Mm-hmm. And just speaking on, looking at these champions or these best practices, on Twitter, even generally, you hear a lot that, Paris wasn't always like this. Amsterdam wasn't always like this. Copenhagen wasn't always like this. We have examples like the Indore iBus BRT system, which was, basically everything that the Delhi BRT system wasn't. And there are all these successful transport project schemes and just complete transformations in different places that we should be able to look at and be like, we know how to improve these systems. So what do you think we can learn, and where do you think we can learn, some lessons that will really improve Indian city transport infrastructure?
No, absolutely. I think and it's often said that India and especially cities in India, you will find very good pilots. But these pilots never go on and become a substantive scale. So we are very good at creating good pilots, but we are not that good in scaling those pilots. And this is what we need. So even if you look at street design, you will find a few kilometers of good pilot in some cities, but we don't have one city which has transformed its entire urban street. Similarly, couple of cities with good bus service, but not something which is transformational in nature. So I think the question for us is, how do we transform, and how do we transform at scale? I think that is really important. And I firmly believe that one way to achieve transformation at scale is by regulation, or by creating or by legislation. So if we are able to pull off this unified metropolitan transport authority, and again, it is very easy to say, last 20 years we have been saying nothing has happened. So if you are able to create this massive institutional change, I think then it will create a huge impact. But also, I think what we also have to look at is, how do we see transport? And so to me, I think transport is not just people moving or goods moving from one part to another. Transport is also, it's an enabler for economic change, right? Because with transport, you provide people with economic opportunities. And therefore, I think to link transport with air quality, with public health, with road safety, with employment, I think we have to elevate the concept of transport beyond just movement of goods from or people from one place to another.
Mm.
And if you're able to convey transport as a conduit for transformation, we will see a much, much stronger buying. Right now, if you go to cities, they will say, but we have pressing issues like water supply, and I have garbage, and I have this and that. Transport is something, it's really not on the priority, on the topmost priority. But if you look at the linkages, then transport is absolutely at top of the priority. So how do you change the conversation? How do you bring the co-benefit argument and create these champions of change who will drive transformation at scale? I think that will be really, really important. But again, it's very easy to say, very difficult to do. Many of us are still figuring out what's the best way forward. So not a very simple and straightforward answer. I am sorry.
Yeah, certainly not. I don't think there is a simple and straightforward answer to such a complex transportation system. And I think, the name of this podcast is called the Pave the Way podcast. And so the last question we ask the guest is, how do you feel, which we've sort of talked about, how do you feel we should pave the way forward to a more sustainable future? But also, let's say in 10 years, do you see improvement in major metropolitan cities around India based on all the knowledge we have and understanding we have of what the issues are and to an extent how we can go about fixing them?
Absolutely. I think now, I personally believe that we will see more positive change happening in our cities than earlier, for a simple reason, is that we are urbanizing, and we will have the new census result shortly. But if you look at the politics in India is still governed through rural areas, because that's where the vote bank is. In many states, the urban issues don't get priority. Even if you look at the political manifesto of many political parties, but that is beginning to change. And simple reason, because we are getting more and more urban. Now, as we get more and more urban, we will have a much larger urban representation in the politics. And that's where some of these issues will come, which we are now seeing coming in both the national as well as the state level. So simply because we are getting more and more urban, we will see a much more push from the political side on addressing urban issues. So that's one. And I'm saying in next 10 years, you will see much more focus on these issues than in the past 10 years. The other important thing is we are also seeing a massive change in transport system as well. And apart from the push towards walking, cycling, there is also a massive push towards zero emission transport. And many cities and countries are now putting up a mandate to ban internal combustion engine, because and many cities which have done extensively good on walking, cycling are now going ahead to the next level, like Paris and London, that we are going to ban internal combustion engine. So the future, as I look at, I think the future of a sustainable city would revolve around three things. And how do you integrate those three things together? So one is transport, second is land use, and third is energy. So a future sustainable city will be that which will be able to integrate the transport, land use, and energy together, because the future will revolve around these three pieces. Now, the problem for us is that we are still struggling to integrate land use and transport. Now, when you bring the energy conversation, the problem gets multiplied to a next level. But I think that is the future. The good thing for us is a lot of our urban infrastructure is yet to be built. So if we plan right, we can really solve a lot of problem at source. And when I say at source, we will be avoiding these problems. Because many countries which are locked in, they are retrofitting the solution. So we will also retrofit in our existing cities. but cities which are expanding, the new cities which are getting created, that's where we can solve the problem. So for us, I personally believe it's a big opportunity, and I am very hopeful that the coming decade would be much more progressive for transport, but also urban issues in general in India.
I think we all hope that. Just one final question before we conclude. Do you think the G20 India presidency is going to have a positive effect in creating a sustainable future?
I personally believe so, because it's a great opportunity for us to elevate some of these conversations at a national level, at an international level. So issues around transport, issues around climate change, issues around sustainability, issues around lifestyle, if you look at. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to elevate some of these conversation at an international forum, which would then shape the global conversation. So I am very hopeful that with some of the work that is happening in India, we'll be able to shape some of the global conversation as well for good. So yeah, I am pretty positive on that.
I'm happy to hear that. Well, that is all my questions for today. So really enlightening conversation for me, and I'm sure it is going to be a really interesting one for the listeners as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, Amit.
Thanks a lot, Akash. Really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.
Me too. Goodbye. Take care.